Hey all, so I'm doing another one of these CCP read-throughs of the spotlights. Now that it is public that I do work for Kabam, I can flat out say that I have played these characters in playtests in a couple different forms of their kits, and so hopefully I can give a little bit of extra insight into how things flow together. Now, unfortunately, this month we do not have the fancy slides that I was able to use last month. We have these text PDFs, and so I'm just going to read through those. The aspect ratio may change a couple times, but please bear with me. Anyway, to touch on the first major thing, Spider-Man Supreme's prestige is pretty darn solid. I believe that puts him 5th as a rank 3. Um, but I think if you look at the 5-star number, he might be 6th. I honestly can't remember exactly where he is as a rank 4, but one way or the other, if unless you are going for number 1 in AQ, if you are planning to invest in this guy, if you're planning to throw sig stones into him, it will be a very worthwhile investment on the prestige front. Definitely holds his own there. So I'm going to skip ahead to just looking over the strengths and weaknesses in general, and it's good to keep in mind a lot of his kit revolves around miss. Additionally, you're going to see a lot of buffs, both his interactions with the opponent's buffs, his ability to give the opponent buffs, his ability to steal buffs that the opponent has, his ability to steal power gain. There's a lot of theft going on here. And all of those things together contribute to a very aggressive, high damage playstyle, as well as, I'll be honest, a fairly tricky defender until you get used to him. Of course, he's also quite well balanced because obviously buff immunity shuts him down almost entirely, but anyone with a relatively low amount of buffs can also play around him pretty well. And if you have a miss counter, you're going to be bypassing a lot of his threat. Additionally, Wither or Petrify or other controls for ability power rate are again just going to take away a lot of the problems. And if you are using him as an attacker against any of those issues, unlike some other characters, it's not that he's going to be shut down completely, but it is going to be much, much more difficult to get what you want out of him, especially against buff immunity. So moving on to the abilities in general, the core of his kit, in my opinion, is really that this first medium attack for either character grants an indefinite buff to the opponent. Now we'll get into exactly why you want to put this buff with no effect on the opponent in a little bit, but it's important to talk about exactly how this works. This will not trigger through block, this will not trigger on an auto block, this will not trigger on you as somebody else attacking into him as a defender if you dex away from it, but it doesn't rely on actually making contact. And what that means is if this ability, or if the abilities that you're caring about for this are not on cooldown, then you can charge at someone and apply this Spider Seal buff to them before your medium actually lands and get the associated benefits that we'll get to later. Additionally, it means that there are a couple places where I have been able to actually throw my medium at the opponent, but they were in a special animation, and even though they were invulnerable due to the special animation, the buff still applied and gave its bonuses. And if you're very careful and you play around with that, there's some cool things to be done. So, additionally, we have bursts of energy damage, personal passives, and buffs cannot have their ability accuracy modified. So there are a couple different wrinkles to this. Buffs not being able to have their ability accuracy modified means that he can actually play through neutralize. Another thing it means is that this can get around glancing. This particularly is very strong against Cersei, because normally if you're hitting into her with her glancing up, you're going to have trouble using basically all of your abilities, and somebody with burst damage, it just wouldn't get through. His do. And so that makes him a really, really good Cersei counter. Additionally, we have this next bit about every unique buff on the opponent reduces their ability power rate by 33%, and then Spider-Man steals that power. and that does go negative. So if you are fighting somebody like a Super Scroll, and you get to the point where they have a Vigilance, Furies, Armor Ups, Power Gain, and their Overload buff, so 5, the power gain they would be getting from their SIG is reduced and then reversed up to 67%, and then Spider-Man gains that power. So this makes him really, really good against Cosmics with power gain and even a couple buffs. He's a very solid Hyperion counter, even though it's not as dramatic as against Super Scroll. Finally, because he places buffs on the opponent, so many buffs on the opponent, he has kind of an interesting interaction with Mystic Dispersion. When these fancy Spider Seal buffs are nullified or expire, he doesn't get the normal power from Mystic Dispersion. Instead, it's just turned into extra damage. So you still benefit from running 5 out of 5, or whatever you run, Mystic Dispersion with this character, and you will gain power from other buffs expiring. But the Spider Seals in particular, since they would give you even more ammo and just go nuts, those are just turned into damage. And it's a significant amount of damage, so do not sleep on that ability. Additionally, just want to call out the developer's note here. While you can invert the opponent's power gain, you can only steal power while they have power, which is just an important thing to keep in mind if you are being really successful in your fight. So, we talked about how when you can apply those Spider Seals with your medium is really important. This is the primary reason, the Blessing of the Astral Form here, because when the opponent gains a Spider Seal, you get the Blessing of the Astral Form, which causes miss. And like I said, because this buff applies before you make contact, if you are running at the opponent with your medium, or they are running at you with their medium, because remember, either character's first medium triggers that Spider Seal buff, then that will trigger this miss ability, which actually makes it extremely safe to intercept with him. Now, you can see in the third bullet point, to jump ahead for a second, that this effect does have a cooldown, somewhere between 10 and 20 seconds, depending on how many buffs the opponent has. Of course, you get it even faster if they go unblockable, which is really nice against somebody like Hulkling. But while you have to be mindful of that cooldown, as long as the ability is on cooldown, he is one of the safest intercept characters in the game for that. And it just, like I said, really lets you be very aggressive. Like I said, the miss can also not be refreshed, even if the opponent goes unblockable, because remember, that bypasses the cooldown, but it means that the miss only triggers if not already active. Keep that in mind if you are going truly ham against somebody who's constantly unblockable. Via buffs, of course. Like it says, you can also get this miss by nullifying Spider Seal buffs, as long as that ability is on cooldown, and intercepting the opponent while you have that miss gives them 3 more buffs. So like I said, it's safe to intercept in the first place. Because of this miss, what you'll often end up doing is lining up that first intercept and then going maybe medium light, dashing back, coming right back in for another medium, and if they've been at all cooperative, dashing back again and going for another medium. Because if you can fit 3 mediums inside that miss, then you can very easily get 9 Spider Seal buffs out of a single rotation of this, because that's 3 mediums, and then 6 more buffs from 2 intercepts. So this is a really, really good way to ramp quickly. So talking about the Spider-Totem, this is why you care about putting all of those buffs on the opponent, and why Spider-Man is stronger against opponents with a lot of buffs. Because there is a counter of how many buffs they gain over the course of the fight, and when you get to 20, or if he's a defender when he gets to 10, this blessing, the Spider-Totem, turns on. This is the orange passive, and this means that instead of your mediums giving the opponent buffs, you nullify them and you do a burst of damage. And keep in mind, because this is talking about nullifying Spider Seal buffs, if you're running Mystic Dispersion, which in my mind you probably should be, then that burst of energy damage is boosted even more by the extra energy damage that happens whenever a spider seal is nullified or expired to replace Mystic Dispersion. Additionally, you get extra attack rating, which will boost, that burst of damage even further. And it will also boost your Mystic Dispersion replacement that is based on modified attack. And then your combat power rate is reduced by 70%, but that doesn't really matter because you gain a bunch of power over time. And again, this lets you play nice and aggressive because you don't have to worry about landing full combos on the opponent because all you care about is your mediums. That's what is fueling your damage, that's what's fueling your fight, and you don't need combos to build power. This ability is doing that for you. Now, when the opponent gains any buff, they also gain a Spider Seal buff while this is active. Now, note that your medium attacks will not be placing Spider Seal buffs on the opponent, but intercepts, if you have the miss up, still will, so you can get some extra buffs that way. You can pause this blessing that way, which is incredibly important because it lets you hold on to your attack rating and that passive power gain. And again, this just means that he is that much better against opponents or nodes that gain their own buffs. As the note at the end there says, though, you need a certain number of Spider Seals on your opponent to land the big special 2, so be mindful that you are not nullifying too many. Now, this is where the intercept that we talked about comes in handy because it can allow you to not really worry about running out. But it's just something to keep in mind, especially if you are in a matchup where you are not able to rely on your miss being available as frequently and you're maybe having to parry medium and back off. Now, this last blessing, this is one that I think you should primarily use in buff-heavy matchups because it doesn't do a whole lot unless your opponent has one of these buffs to steal. So Fury, Precision, Cruelty, Armor Up, all very common. And then Regeneration or Pierce, a little more niche. And as it says, each one of these, it's not that he steals the opponent's version of that buff. He steals a standardized version. So 20% for most of them, and then 2.2% of max health for the regen, all over 10 seconds. Now what this means is that you don't necessarily have to worry about his heavy if there aren't buffs to steal. But if you're facing somebody like Hulkling, Super Skrull, Cersei, any Cosmic where there are these buffs to steal, you probably want to land a heavy as quickly as you possibly can, because then as you're wailing on them, as they're throwing specials, as they're triggering all these buffs, so are you. And obviously stealing regen against somebody like Hulkling is amazing. Stealing Pierce allows you to just cut through those Cosmics that much faster. We all know what Precision and Cruelty do. Armor is going to make you tankier. And again, all of those bursts of energy damage we've talked about in the kit will be boosted further by those Furies. So if you are facing someone who triggers these, doesn't need to be a Cosmic, but those are the obvious targets. Heavy as soon as you can, and once this expires, try and get it back up. This is something that you want pretty much permanent uptime on against buff-heavy matchups. Additionally, this happens as a defender, so be very careful if you're using somebody that would trigger even something as simple as a regen for him to steal it. Or, of course, just land a bunch of heavies against him. That's often going to be fairly simple if you're using, go-to science champions, but certain nodes are going to make it harder, so just watch for it. Alright, so the special one throws a bunch of Spider Seal buffs on the opponent. Like we talked about, this is kind of the ammo for the rest of your kit, and so especially if you're having trouble landing a bunch of intercepts, this is going to be your primary way to ramp very quickly. Of course, if you are throwing enough intercepts, maybe you can kind of skip this and go to the special 2, but it's very important to keep in mind how this works. And then, as it says, if you have thrown your heavy attack and you have Blessing of the Web active, then you get this Curse of the Web ability on the special one, which reduces the potency of all of those 6 buffs by 95% for 20 seconds. So almost zeroes them out. But they still happen. You're not preventing them entirely, they're not expiring early, you're not nullifying them. You're just basically zeroing them out for the opponent while you continue to steal them. So against somebody like, again, Hulkling, he's only getting 5% of his normal benefit from regen, from Fury, from Pierce, and you're getting your 20% Furies, your 20% Pierces, your 2.2% regens. This is a very powerful ability if you're in a matchup where stealing buffs is already helping you. So moving on to the Special 2, this is your damage payout. If your opponent doesn't have a lot of their own buffs, and if you're staying on top of your intercepts and ramping your Spider Seals quickly, like I said, you may come straight to this. Otherwise, maybe you're going to go for the Special 1 first, you're going to weave in some heavies, but you're going to try to arrive at the Special 2 while you have the Blessing of the Spider-Totem active, because you want that attack increase. If you have that attack increase, then the 3 hits, the big energy waves, are all going to deal energy damage. If you have Blessing of the Spider-Totem active, then each hit also nullifies a Spider Seal buff off of them, deals a burst of energy damage for each buff nullified, and if you're running Mystic Dispersion, because you nullified a Spider Seal buff, you get even more energy damage, and assuming you're in Blessing of the Spider-Totem, all of those numbers get boosted because your attack is higher. And you can do this through block. Which means that combining it with his miss ability and how much power he can gain in a lot of these matchups between Mystic Dispersion and his Power Steal ability, sometimes you're just constantly spamming Special 2s and melting the opponent. It's very, very fun once you get the hang of this guy to just spam these. So then the Special 3, I don't think you're going to always use. The root passive is good, but it's very important to remember that rooted champions throw heavy attacks way more often. Now that means that they are going to give you openings. So the fact that while they're rooted, you power steal them, gain power for yourself, and put more Spider Seal buffs on them, that is very strong. But I would only kind of do this if you're getting some other control of the matchup benefit from it, because often you can just get those Spider Seal buffs other ways. You don't necessarily need the root, and you probably have some other way of stealing their power and gaining your own. But if for some reason the Special 1 isn't really working out for you, if the opponent doesn't have a lot of their own buffs, maybe if you're finding intercepting difficult or you can't rely on your miss to make it safe, then the Special 3 is a good way to ramp safely, because you don't need to worry about intercepts, you just need to worry about contact. This means you can even block the opponent, assuming they're not throwing heavy attacks, and get Spider Seals that way. So, the signature ability just makes all of his blessings stronger. So when Blessing of the Astral Form goes into cooldown, meaning when your miss goes into cooldown, at the end of that 3 seconds, you gain a burst of 15% of your maximum power, allowing you to ramp through things that much quicker. For the Blessing of the Spider-Totem, those bursts of energy damage are just increased by 50%. Note that the wording of this, just increasing their potency, means that it does scale with all of those attack modifications, so you can just take that 50% boost to the bank. And then for Blessing of the Web, you increase the potency of all those buffs by 50%, and remember that that is a relative 50%, so that makes the 20% Fury a 30% Fury. The signature ability is very good. I would liken it to somebody like Hyperions or Silver Surfers, where it just really ties the rest of the kit together and kind of makes it sing. So let's talk about the synergies. So with these other Supremes, Symbiote Supreme and Sorcerer Supreme, if you put Spider Seal buffs on an opponent that has no other buffs, then you just get yet another burst of energy damage. Like I said, he can get very aggressive very quickly. But I think the other side of this synergy for the other two Supremes is even stronger. If you've played Symbiote Supreme a fair amount, you know that getting genetic potential is the most important thing for your kit actually functioning, and if your staggers aren't nullifying buffs off the opponent, you're probably having some trouble getting genetic potential. So this just allowing him to land a bunch of staggers, have them expire naturally, and still let him go through his loop is very, very cool. I think that significantly broadens his use cases. And for Sorcerer Supreme, she already has armor breaks magnifying her damage. She already hits plenty hard under certain circumstances. Now her special attacks also inflict this energy vulnerability debuff. I imagine this getting pretty nuts with power backs, honestly, because it's important to remember that if your opponent does not have energy resistance of their own, 1200 negative energy resistance is a larger difference than 1200 positive energy resistance just because of the way the diminishing returns calculation works. So this is very, very strong for Sorcerer. Looking at the From the Contest one, this is just highlighting the fact that Spider-Man Supreme in this form is actually an original creation of Kabam. It pays homage to the comic book character that I know a lot of you are familiar with, but several things are different. I honestly don't know all of the details, but it is technically, from Marvel's perspective, an original creation. So, critical hits from lights now also grant Spider Seal buffs to the opponents. This means you don't have to just focus on your first mediums, you can just land crits. And because he's a Spider-Man, he does have a decent crit rate. So that's very strong for speeding up his ramp. Overseer gaining immunity to neutralize is huge. This is mostly a counter to Wiccan and Rintra, not so much to Tigra because you shouldn't be getting hit by her anyway, but this means that he can take Rintra without worrying about his buffs not working, and he can parry Wiccan safely without getting that neutralized debuff on himself. So very, very cool there. For Venom the Duck, this just means you get more buffs. I think that is going to just matter even more when solo incursions becomes a thing and Venom the Duck stock goes up. For Venom Pool, this is awesome because he already has really significant immunities against techs. You have Shock, Power Drain, Power Burn, and Armor Break. Sorry, took me a second. This adds Special Lock immunity, so that node in Alliance War that Special Locks you, that right now I think only Gallon gets around, now Venom Pool can also get around it. And when it says this immunity counts for his illogical DNA ability, that means that triggering it gives him 50 cooking meter and ramps him faster. Very, very good for him. And then for Morningstar, this is pretty nuts, because her special attack... Her Special 2 is already kind of the damage focus of her kit, where as long as the opponent has a few buffs, she can just cash that out to destroy them. Now it ramps with the rest of her kit. So if she has 5 souls, then she treats the opponent as though they always have 5 more buffs. It's going to be very, very good. This Villain 1, Blessing of the Spider-Totem, also gives you critical rating. Crits are nice, but I think probably the strongest part of this ability is that it allows it to trigger the previous synergy more frequently, since that keys off of critical hits, and nothing else in his ability really, or nothing else in his kit really does. For Kraven, you get an Infuriate debuff when a trap activates. Now, I want to clarify that this is when the activation timer starts. So after the trap goes down, but it hasn't activated yet, the timer that signifies, hey, it's going to activate, the beginning of that infuriates them. So, as somebody pointed out, this does have the small downside of if you back off and they charge at you because they're infuriated and they come in front of the trap, it may now be a little bit difficult to back them up if you don't have a special ready. But if you either have a special ready or you can keep them behind the trap until it arms and then let them charge over it, this should make Kraven significantly easier to play. So for Vulture, this just lets him ramp faster, which lets him do everything else faster and better. I still have my issues with Vulture's kit, but if you already like Vulture, I think that you probably want this. Carnage, this is going to be nuts with the upcoming Venom Battlecast relic, because that already made Carnage quite good. Giving him 60% more buffs, because I believe his current maximum is 5, increasing that to 8 should be pretty darn significant. And then Electro, like this says, this does put a shock passive on the opponent, but that's not really the point here. That'll be some damage. The real point is that when Electro shocks himself, he starts hitting harder. So this will ramp him more than it hurts the opponent, and should make Electro more fun to use. And then we have our Spider-Verse one. I left off the name for this one. It's triggered at 3-star and above. There was just a page break. But as you can see, it's with all of these characters here. This first one, quite good. It means that if you're stealing buffs with Blessing of the Web, you can sometimes get 2 of them. It should just be nuts against somebody like Hulkling, like we said earlier. It increases Spider-Man 2099's debuff pause duration, which means that you have to worry less about dexing, and you can be a bit more aggressive. That should really help his rotation feel easier. Spider-Gwen getting a longer Enervate means you have to worry a little bit less about the RNG of it triggering on each hit. I think that's a pretty significant buff to her. Spider-Man's Stealth Suit, now he can purify debuffs. This should be pretty nuts, honestly, because you can just dex to purify a debuff, and dexing already triggers his synergy with Scorpion. I think we're going to see very strong things out of him soon, especially with how annoying the hazard shift nodes on the map are right now. And then Spider-Man Stark Enhanced, a significant reduction to the power drain on his heavy, the EMP web shot. That basically just makes power drain a more realistic part of his kit, because if you've played Stark Enhanced Spider-Man, you know that that's mostly a break glass in case of emergencies power drain, and this should make it a bit more accessible. So overall, I think this is a really strong character. He's good on defense. You want a miss counter against him if you're not able to stun him and stick to lights. He can be quite dangerous. Do not block his special 2, especially in war or battlegrounds where your opponent will be running Mystic Dispersion for all of the reasons that I talked about with Mystic Dispersion when I was reading through it. But I also think he's a very cool attacker that's different than other Mystics, answers some particularly thorny problems in the Cosmic class, and gets around some things like Nullify Immunity, Glancing, etc. in a really interesting way. I definitely want him on my roster. And I gotta be honest, it's mostly for that Venom Pool synergy, but in general, I think he's very worth having. And I'm looking forward to it. So hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments how you're feeling about his introduction. And if you haven't checked out the Spotlight yet, that's going to feel so weird to say repeatedly, go ahead and check out that video. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.